is Robert Rauschenberg. And I'm really, to this day, not terribly confident in how to classify Robert Rauschenberg. He used a lot of the same techniques and a lot of the same materials that pop artists used, but he uses them in a way that's still elevated to the presence of fine art, whereas pop artists really weren't concerned with the status of fine art. They even today they would be considered something like lowbrow art, which is basically less than fine art in the world of fine arts and critics. But Robert Rauschenberg does he combines three-dimensional elements. He uses collage. He uses screen printing. He does a lot of freestanding sculpture, and he's very, very successful. We're going to talk about Andy Warhol a little bit later, but just know Robert Rauschenberg was like the fine arts version of Andy Warhol. They used a lot of the same techniques, but Robert Rauschenberg is considered a fine artist, whereas Andy Warhol is a weirdo doing pop art. I don't know. Andy Warhol's also very difficult to classify. I mean, he's definitely a pop artist, but I'm not too terribly confident that he was a human. I've used the word pop art a few times, and this is the first real example that we've seen of it. Now, pop art it's an attempt to challenge the relationship that you have with the imagery that surrounds you. Most specifically, that's referring to the media. How many advertisements do you see in the course of a day, and what types of things are those advertisements trying to convince you of? So Richard Hamilton, who is a British pop artist, when he asks you what your relationship with the imagery that surrounds you, he wants you to look at this and see that it's kind of ridiculous. You know, if you're supposed to be this particular guy and have this particular girl, or be this particular girl and have that particular guy, and you're supposed to eat this type of ham, and if you're a successful somebody, you got to have this reel-to-reel, and you need this furniture, and you have to drive a Ford, and you're going to have a maid, and you're going to have this vacuum cleaner, and you're going to have this high-rise apartment, and outside you're going to see these performances. He took all these images from advertisements and combined them in a way that does seem pretty absurd, and I believe that what he wants you to do is to look at this and say, well, what is my relationship with all this stuff? And the conclusion to come to is that, well, I don't have a relationship with this. It's stupid. It doesn't make any sense. So as you then move forward and progress through your day, then the conclusion that you're supposed to have is, as you look at all of these advertisements and as you look at the imagery you're surrounding yourself with, you can tell yourself, well, none of this really corresponds with me because it's ridiculous anyway. And that's what Richard Hamilton wanted you to get from that. But not everybody was on the same page. Lichtenstein, I think, was probably still in the same area of Richard Hamilton, except Lichtenstein, he liked having fun with his artwork, almost had this childlike approach to it. But he would take these panels that he would find in comic books and blow them up on a scale that would allow them to be presented in a gallery. But the whole thing is that it's melodramatic, it's overblown, it's completely unnecessary, and that's really what he wants you to get from this, is that, you know, when we become so interested in our own junk, then, you know, it might seem like it's really important, but in all honesty, it doesn't really matter. Had a lot of fun with his artwork, and that's really admirable, because a lot of people at the time were absolutely not. It's hard to have fun when you're living in the Cold War and constantly dealing with the fact that at any moment in time you could be completely eliminated. You and your entire culture could be eliminated from the face of the earth. And that's just part of daily existence. At any point in time, it could be now or it could be now. You just don't know. At any moment. Now that brings us to Andy Warhol. There's information written about Andy Warhol. He's definitely the Salvador Dali of his generation, in that there are a lot of weird people doing weird things, but Andy Warhol is a cult of personality that has developed around just how strange he was as a human being. There's a ton of backstory there. There are reasons that he can justify his weirdness. In fact, he died twice after being shot by someone who was upset with him for really good reason. I'll just let the information that's below on Blackboard sort of fill the rest of that out for you. If you get a chance to watch a documentary or something about Andy Warhol, you will not be disappointed, I promise you. I just don't have the time to get through all of it today. Fascinating guy. Bridget Riley is part of an art movement known as op art, like op art. This is a good example of that. an attempt to evoke a physical response through visual imagery. So if you look at this and you start to feel queasy, or if you start to feel like the whole thing's moving, then like, gosh, she got you. She won. She won op art because she's eliciting a physical response by providing visual stimulus. This was something that was somewhat popular for a few years, but it was always sort of something on the fringe. Minimalism, however, is something that did gain a foothold and was much more popular. This is minimalism. Donald Judd's Untitled here. This is something that he did kind of over and over again, was make these things that look like shelves. But minimalism isn't about just the objects themselves. It's about the objects and the way that they manipulate the space around them. It's about the materiality that's used in those objects. I believe I've got some information typed out about that below too. So rather than me going on and on about that, I will tell you that minimalism gets used a lot in public spaces because it couldn't possibly offend anyone. In fact, on the Forsyth Tech's main campus, there's a large minimalist sculpture in front of the building. But the problem with minimalism is that it doesn't give you a lot to work with, and there are a lot of people that weren't even clear that that was a piece of artwork and not construction material or something, which brings us to another point. The materiality of minimalism is that they use industrial materials as a means of being able to basically manufacture the artwork. In the same way that the Impressionists and Expressionists really use their presence, use the texture of the paint and the imprint of the tools and the sculpture and the clay to tell you something deeper about the subject matter. Well, the minimalists are doing the exact opposite of that, and they want to use materials that doesn't leave any impression, any human impression there. The minimalist part of minimalism is supposed to be minimalizing the presence of the artist, and it's important that you know that. Minimalism is referring to minimalizing the presence of the artist, and that comes in the shape of using these particular types of materials, in using a lot of repetition so that you have that sense of mass manufacturing. There's a little more to it than that. I do think that there is good minimalism, but there's also a lot of really bad minimalism. Ava Hess is a slightly different story. She was supposed to be the world's next great sculptor. She was clearly talented and capable. She was exploring all sorts of different materials, and she was motivated beyond belief to be capable of fulfilling the expectations that everybody had for her. But the problem is, she was diagnosed, I think when she was 19, with an inoperable brain tumor. So the few years that she had remaining were spent in the studio, basically all day and all night just producing artwork. But she did die, I think, when she was 26 years old, just before she was at the point where she could really make a name for herself, which is really disappointing. So in this particular piece, you can still see the same materiality, the same simplicity, the same type of repetition that we were looking at in Donald Judd's, and the same thing that you saw in the other oak piece that I was showing you, but this one seems a lot more fragile. And I keep referring back to this piece whenever I have to talk about Ava Hesse, because to me, this is the embodiment of her version of the human experience. It's prolific, but it's fragile. It's chaotic, but there's some control to it. It's balanced, but it's constantly on the verge of just falling apart. It seems like you could just tug on one of these threads and the whole thing would fall to the ground. And that's the thing. I might be projecting all this because I knew about her medical condition, but I still think that this is a pretty remarkable piece, especially for someone that was as young as she is. When we were talking about Marcel Duchamp, I said that in, say, 50 or 60 years, artists were going to look back at works like The Fountain and see the value of what it was that he was trying to convey. Joseph Kosuth was one of those artists who really, really loved conceptual artwork, and conceptual artwork is exactly this. It's essentially calling into question the way that you relate to and identify everything that's around you, the general concept of reality. This piece, for example, 1 in 3 chairs, is challenging you to question which one of these chairs is the realist version of the chair. Is it the three-dimensional object that exists and takes up space? Is it the visual representation in 2 dimensions of the object? Or is it the definition of the object, which doesn't exist in any dimension whatsoever other than just conceptually. And the argument that he's making is that each one of these is pretty much equally chair. Yeah, this might be a three-dimensional chair, but you can't sit in it because it's an art piece, so it's technically just as valuable as a chair as this picture of a chair is. So if these two are equally chair, then what about this thing over here? There are several artists in the conceptual art movement. The problem is the work gets really redundant and repetitive. There's not but so many times you can put something in a gallery just for the sake of challenging someone's conception of reality and then having them have that same novel response to it. So, well, if you have a pencil, but the pencil is too large to pick up and you can no longer write with it, well, is it still a pencil? Well, if you have a chair that you can't sit in, is it still a chair? It's that type of thing, which is a valid question to ask, and there's some nobility in what they're attempting to do, but it does get really, really repetitive. As proof that conceptual artists drew inspiration from Marcel Duchamp, here's Bruce Nauman doing his own homage to Marcel Duchamp's fountain, and essentially saying that, well, I'm a fountain too. By the understanding that we established through Marcel Duchamp, he is in fact a fountain, because he says he is. So, the fact that you're seeing so many different forms of artistic expression is evidence that the culture that we're moving into is something that's called Post-Modernism. We had modernism. Modernism is this new generation of people who needs a new means of expressing themselves. Well, following the Second World War, saying that we're a new generation of people who need a new means of expressing ourselves couldn't be more of an understatement. People really are becoming a lot more introspective. They're a lot less interested in being part of a large cultural movement because, hey, Nazis were a large cultural movement. The Soviet Union was a large cultural movement. Being able to see yourself as an individual and to value the perspective that every single individual person has is really what postmodernism is getting into. If you are an artist, then you can make artwork any way that you want to. It can take on any form that you want to. It can come from any place that you want it to conceptually, and it's just as valid as the artwork that anybody else is producing, because if you have your own perspective and if you are your own person, then you are a world unto yourself. You have your own reality, and I can't expect you to accept my judgments and my limitations as your judgments and your limitations if you are your own reality. That's postmodernism in a nutshell. There are a lot of people in academics and other areas of the world that have a lot of issue with the fundamental principles of postmodernism. Robert Smithson's spiral jetties is part of there was a movement that this was a piece of, but there's a term that I want to give you, really two terms I want to give you. The first one is an installation. An installation is any space that's specifically modified to convey a specific content. And it usually comes in the form of a site-specific sculpture like this one. It's something that's made specifically to exist in this one space because it's modifying this one space. So an installation is any modified space that's intent to convey some specific thing. That's what an installation is. We're going to talk very specifically about installations in a coming module. But for right now, just as long as you understand what an installation is, then you're fine in regards to that. Another term that you need to know is earthworks. Now, earthworks are installations constructed of materials found on site. So Robert Smithson just took the sand and the rocks that were already here on this shoreline and pushed them together into this spiral shape. Christo and Jean-Claude were also really good, really successful installation artists. This particular piece, Running Fence, is characteristic of some of the work they do because it exists on a very large scale. They're very ambitious in the scale that they build on, and it focuses on fabric and the way that fabric interacts with space and objects around it. It really causes you to question the nature of the space that's enclosed within it or the way that it alters the space around it. Good example of their work, like this one for example, is referred to as the gates. They just lined all the walkways in Central Park with these, well, they call them gates, but it's like a frame with this orange nylon fabric hanging from it. You would walk through, let's say that you walk through Central Park on your way to or from work every day, or you would take a walk at lunch. Well, there's no way that you could possibly take that same walk through this space and see it the same way as you did before the gates were there. And this is obviously a temporary installation. So once it was taken down, it was life. It was back to life as usual. But what they were trying to do is get you to really appreciate the sense of space that you have there, and to be conscious of what it was that you're experiencing at all points in time. Everything is susceptible to change. They've also done installations like this where they make these stacks of 55-gallon oil drums. Usually these are in response to large-scale oil spills, where you might hear on the news that 500,000 gallons of oil have been spilled from a tanker somewhere, but it's an abstract number, and it's hard to envision exactly what that means. So what they're attempting to do here is to provide a tangible, physical, approachable form to something that's otherwise just a completely abstract concept. Miriam Schapiro, Judy Chicago, Cindy Sherman, and Louise Nevelson are all part of what's referred to as the feminist art movement, and I wish we had a lot more time to discuss that. I do want to take some time and talk about Cindy Sherman. This is an untitled film still. Her whole thing is she would personify these female cliches, and she would adopt these different personalities and document the life that grew up around that personality in the form of film stills and in the form of photographs and things like that. She was a photographer before she moved to New York, and her plan was to move to New York to become an artist, but when she got there she realized that she was terrified of the city, so she ended up becoming a shut-in, but still wanted to be a photographer, so she used herself and her own life as her subject matter, but became different people as a means of creating something that was variable and different. Louise Nevelson is also considered an abstract expressionist sculptor. She's an absolute powerhouse of an artist and a very impressive woman. She didn't compromise on anything. She had an artistic vision, and not only in her artwork, but as a human being. She had multiple studios. You see that this is an assemblage of these sort of boxes and shapes. She had 3 different phases in her career. There was the white phase, the black phase, and the gold phase, and they overlapped somewhat. So she would actually have different studios. One was for the black work, one was for the white work, and one was for the gold work. Well, she felt like they needed to exist in different spaces, and by this point in time she'd become so successful that she could financially make that happen. But she would routinely show up to work in her studio wearing fur coats and pearl necklaces and things like that, because that's who she was as a person, and she was not willing to compromise that. These might not look like they're all that interesting or impressive, but they have a very, very strong presence. Whenever you're in front of one of these things, it does seem like it's almost visually overwhelming, but it's visually overwhelming in a way that feels almost comfortable. It's a strange sensation, but just know Louise Nevelson, I'm going to use the word fascinating again, but interesting woman who did a lot of very interesting work. Elizabeth Murray is a great example of a postmodern artist, and she died in 2007, but also used to get a lot of attention for her ability to combine different elements of different art styles. You're looking at something that's technically a painting, but it's got these irregular edges which make it seem like it's possibly a sculptural object, and who's to say that it's not? You've also got what appears to be very gestural. So a lot of art critics refer to the action painting or gesture painting as an influence here. The color-filled artist also could be an inspiration here, just by the fact that this thing it is such a large shape that's broken into these giant patches of pure color. But what's probably easily overlooked here is the fact that this is also heavily influenced by Cubism, because what you're looking at is actually a flower in a vase sitting on top of a table. And you can see the top of the table here with the flower on it, and these things that extend out from the side are the legs of the table, but instead of just extending straight down, the legs of the table go kind of out, and then some of them turn back upward. So she's playing with perspective, and she's also playing with different forms of abstract expressionism. She's also playing with different fields of art, 2-dimensional, 3-dimensional, who's to say? Oh, I forgot Anselm Kiefer was part of this. I'm just going to have to incorporate Anselm Kiefer in a module later. Anselm Kiefer is the Michelangelo of our generation, and I know that looking at this particular image, again, you might not be convinced of what I'm saying, but let me find some good references and type up some information in a module that we'll look at later, and then hopefully I can sell you on them then. Anselm Kiefer, in 500 years, he's the artist that people are going to be looking back and it's like, oh, well, around the year 2000, this was what was good artwork. So I feel like Anselm Kiefer is a pretty good place to end this presentation. I think what should be gleaned from the diversity of what you see here is that once we get past 1945, once we emerge from the wreckage of the Second World War, the world becomes a very different place, and it's much more individualistic, it's much more introspective, and if you're an artist, you're not only encouraged to explore different fields of expression, by the time you get to, say, the 1980s, if you're doing work that's similar to the work that other people are doing, then you don't get respect as an artist because you're technically just copying them. And then because postmodernism was such a strong cultural presence, it's just expected that every artist, given that they have their own perspective, given that they are a world unto themselves, should be producing artwork that is specific to them. And if your artwork looks like somebody else, then it can't be just yours.